She walked out the door one morning and was never seen again. Margaret Rose Thompson, just 23 years old, kissed her husband goodbye as he left for work at the local factory. Her two young children, Tommy and Susan, ages 4 and 6, were still sleeping peacefully in their beds. Margaret had her usual morning routine planned: coffee, breakfast preparation, maybe some gardening in the backyard where her prized tomatoes were finally ripening. But when her husband James returned home that evening, calling out his usual, "Honey, I'm home," there was only silence. The coffee pot sat cold on the stove, breakfast dishes remained unwashed in the sink, and Margaret's favorite apron hung untouched on its hook by the kitchen window. The children had woken to an empty house, confused and frightened, calling for their mother who never answered. James searched every room, every closet, even the basement and attic. Her purse was gone, but everything else remained exactly as she'd left it. No note, no explanation, no sign of struggle. It was as if Margaret had simply vanished into thin air. By nightfall, panic had set in. James called the police, his voice shaking as he tried to explain that his wife, his reliable, loving wife who never went anywhere without telling him, had disappeared without a trace. Within hours, search parties formed throughout the small community. Neighbors grabbed flashlights and combed through nearby woods. Police officers questioned everyone on their street, hoping someone had seen something, anything, that might provide a clue. But as dawn broke over Millbrook, Margaret Rose Thompson remained missing, leaving behind 2 bewildered children and a husband whose world had suddenly, inexplicably, fallen apart. The search was just beginning, but nobody could have imagined it would last 63 long years. Detective Frank Morrison had seen missing person cases before, but something about Margaret Thompson's disappearance unsettled him. In his 15 years with the Millbrook Police Department, people didn't just vanish without leaving some trace behind. Yet here he stood, 3 days after Margaret's disappearance, with absolutely nothing to go on. The investigation began methodically. Search teams combed every inch of Route 47, the winding road that connected Millbrook to the neighboring towns. They checked abandoned barns, old mining shafts, and the murky waters of Willow Creek that meandered through the countryside. Bloodhounds picked up Margaret's scent at the front door of her home, but it mysteriously ended at the sidewalk, as if she had simply dissolved into the morning air. Detective Morrison knocked on every door within a 5-mile radius. Mrs. Henderson, who lived across the street, remembered seeing Margaret water her flowers around 8 in the morning. "She waved at me like she always did," the elderly woman recalled, wringing her hands nervously. Such a sweet girl, always had time for a friendly word. But beyond that single sighting, it was as if Margaret had become invisible. Her colleagues at the local church where she volunteered knew nothing. The postman hadn't seen her. Even the milkman, who made his rounds every Tuesday morning, noticed nothing unusual. As days turned into weeks, theories began to emerge. Some whispered about a possible kidnapping. Maybe someone had been watching the young mother, waiting for the perfect moment when she was alone. Others suggested she might have left voluntarily, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood and marriage. The darkest theory involved an accident, maybe a fall into the river, though extensive searches of the waterways yielded nothing. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, ran the headline that would define the case for decades to come. "Young woman disappears without a trace." The article featured Margaret's wedding photo, her bright smile now haunting in its innocence, and pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Meanwhile, James Thompson had become a man possessed. He organized volunteer search parties that scoured the countryside every weekend. He plastered missing person posters on every telephone pole, store window, and church bulletin board within 50 miles. His children barely saw him, as he spent every waking moment searching for their mother, driven by a desperate hope that was slowly consuming him. The investigation was thorough, but it was also hitting dead ends at every turn. Word of Margaret Thompson's disappearance spread like wildfire across the rural communities of central Ohio. What had started as a local tragedy quickly became a regional obsession, touching the hearts of people who had never even met the missing young mother. By the end of July, volunteers were arriving from towns as far as 60 miles away. Farmers left their fields early to join search parties. Factory workers spent their weekends tramping through dense forests and overgrown meadows. Housewives packed sandwiches and thermoses of coffee for the searchers, transforming the Thompson family's backyard into an impromptu command center. The Riverside Methodist Church, where Margaret had sung in the choir every Sunday, organized the largest search effort yet seen in the county. Pastor Williams coordinated teams of 50 volunteers at a time, armed with maps, whistles, and an unwavering determination to bring Margaret home. They searched abandoned farmhouses, explored cave systems, and waded through swamps where the summer heat made every step feel like walking through molasses. As August arrived with no sign of Margaret, the community's response took on an almost spiritual quality. Every evening at sunset, St. Mary's Catholic Church held candlelight vigils on the town square. Hundreds of people would gather in silence, their flickering candles creating a sea of hope in the growing darkness. Children who barely understood what had happened clutched small votive candles, while elderly residents whispered prayers that had sustained them through 2 world wars. But hope began to mix with something else entirely: fear. If a young woman could vanish without a trace in broad daylight from the safety of her own home, what did that mean for everyone else? Parents started walking their children to school. Women stopped going out alone after dark. Door locks that had rarely been used suddenly became essential. The theories grew wilder with each passing day. Some spoke of mysterious strangers seen near the railroad tracks. Others whispered about an old hermit who lived deep in the woods beyond Miller's Pond. A few even suggested supernatural explanations, that Margaret had been taken by forces beyond human understanding. Margaret Rose Thompson was no longer just a missing person. She had become something approaching folklore. Her name was spoken in hushed tones at church socials and grocery store checkout lines. Children dared each other to walk past her empty house after dark. Local teenagers told embellished stories about the beautiful young woman who had simply vanished into thin air, adding new details with each retelling. The community had rallied like never before, but their greatest efforts had yielded nothing but more questions and deeper mysteries. Time, they say, heals all wounds. But for the Thompson family, time became their cruelest enemy. By 1960, 3 years after Margaret's disappearance, the search parties had dwindled to a dedicated few. The newspaper headlines that once screamed her name had been replaced by stories of the space race and civil rights movements. The world was moving forward, but the Thompsons remained frozen in that terrible July morning when everything changed. Detective Morrison, now graying at the temples, made one final push before retiring. He spread Margaret's case files across his desk, dozens of folders filled with witness statements, search maps, and dead-end leads. The evidence boxes were carefully labeled and stored in the basement of the police station, joining hundreds of other unsolved cases that gathered dust in the darkness. Margaret Thompson had officially become a cold case. Her children, Tommy and Susan, were growing up in the shadow of their mother's absence. Tommy, now 10, had stopped asking when Mommy was coming home. Susan, 12, had taken on household responsibilities far beyond her years, trying to fill a void that could never truly be filled. James had aged a decade in those 3 years, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, his eyes holding a permanent sadness that no amount of hope could entirely mask. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Mother's Day became a painful reminder of who was missing from their table. James kept Margaret's clothes in their bedroom closet, her favorite coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet, her books on the nightstand, as if maintaining these shrines might somehow call her back from wherever she had gone. The extended family tried to encourage James to move on, to consider the possibility that Margaret might never return. Well-meaning friends suggested he think about dating again, that the children needed a mother figure, but James couldn't bring himself to take off his wedding ring or remove the family photos that still included Margaret's radiant smile. In the community, Margaret's story had evolved from urgent news to local legend. New residents moving to Millbrook would eventually hear the tale of the young woman who vanished without a trace. Her name faded from headlines, but not from the hearts of those who loved her. The case files sat undisturbed in their boxes, each folder a testament to unanswered questions and unfulfilled hopes. Margaret Thompson had become a ghost in her own town, remembered by some, forgotten by many, but never truly gone from the hearts of her family, who continued to believe that somewhere, somehow, she was still alive. Years turned into decades, and still the mystery remained unsolved, locked away in basement files and broken hearts. The 1960s brought revolution to America, civil rights, rock and roll, and a generation that questioned everything. But in Millbrook, one question remained unanswered. What happened to Margaret Thompson? As the years rolled by like pages in a forgotten book, her story became woven into the very fabric of the community's identity. Children who hadn't even been born in 1957 grew up hearing whispered tales about the woman who vanished. In the 1970s, teenagers would dare each other to spend a night near the old Thompson house, now occupied by a new family who had grown tired of answering questions about the previous owners. Local school children wrote essays about local legends, and Margaret's name appeared in nearly every one. By the 1980s, the mystery had taken on a life of its own. Conspiracy theories flourished like weeds in an abandoned garden. Some claimed Margaret had been involved with organized crime. Perhaps she had witnessed something she shouldn't have, and dangerous people had made her disappear. Others suggested she had orchestrated her own vanishing, tired of small-town life and the responsibilities of motherhood, perhaps starting fresh with a new identity in a distant city. The most elaborate theory involved a secret double life. According to local folklore, Margaret had been leading a clandestine existence, possibly as a government informant during the height of Cold War paranoia. This theory gained traction when a retired factory worker claimed he had once seen Margaret talking to a man in a black sedan just days before her disappearance, though his story changed with each telling. In 1987, a local history teacher named Patricia Wells published Vanished, the Margaret Thompson Mystery, a slim paperback that sold out at every bookstore within a 100-mile radius. Wells had interviewed dozens of people who claimed to remember details from that fateful summer, though many of their recollections contradicted each other spectacularly. Radio talk shows picked up the story whenever news was slow. Amil, the local AM station, ran a special series every July called The Millbrook Mystery, featuring call-ins from listeners who shared their own theories or claimed to have new information. Most calls led nowhere, but they kept Margaret's memory alive in the collective consciousness of the region. Private investigators occasionally took interest in the case, drawn by the complete absence of clues and the challenge it presented. A few claimed to have breakthrough leads, a sighting in California, a woman matching Margaret's description in Florida, documents suggesting she had assumed a new identity. But every lead dissolved under scrutiny like morning mist. Through it all, James Thompson continued his quiet vigil. Now a grandfather, whose own children struggled to explain to their kids why Grandpa sometimes stared at old photographs with tears in his eyes. The decades had brought no answers, only more questions and theories that seemed to multiply with each passing year. The year 2020 brought a global pandemic that forced the world indoors, but it also brought something else entirely unexpected. A digital revolution that would finally crack the oldest cold case in Millbrook's history. While millions of people passed time during lockdown by exploring their family heritage through DNA testing kits, one particular test would unlock secrets that had been buried for more than 6 decades. Sarah Chen, a genealogist in Portland, Oregon, had spent the pandemic helping people trace their family trees through popular ancestry websites. It was routine work, connecting distant cousins, solving family mysteries, reuniting people with relatives they never knew existed. But on a rainy Tuesday morning in November, Sarah encountered something that made her coffee grow cold as she stared at her computer screen in disbelief. A DNA match had appeared for one of her clients, a strong familial connection to someone named Margaret Rose Palmer, an 86-year-old woman living quietly in a retirement community in Tucson, Arizona. The match was significant enough to suggest a parent-child relationship. But Sarah's client was Tommy Thompson, now 67 years old, who had been searching for any trace of his mother who had vanished in 1957. Sarah's hands trembled as she cross-referenced the data. Margaret Rose Palmer had been born in 1934, the same year as Margaret Rose Thompson. The facial recognition software she ran on the woman's driver's license photo against the 1957 missing person photos showed an 87% probability match, accounting for natural aging. The pieces were falling into place with mathematical precision that seemed almost impossible after so many years. But the most compelling evidence came from the DNA itself. The genetic markers were undeniable. Margaret Rose Palmer shared identical DNA sequences with Tommy Thompson that could only exist between a mother and son. After 63 years of questions, science had provided an answer that seemed too extraordinary to believe. Sarah picked up her phone with shaking fingers and dialed Tommy Thompson's number. When he answered, she could barely find her voice. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "I think I've found your mother, and she's alive." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like eternity. When Tommy finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Could she really be alive after 63 years? In that moment, decades of grief, hope, and unanswered questions collided with the stunning possibility that the impossible had somehow become possible. The woman who had vanished without a trace might have been living just a few states away, carrying a different name, but the same DNA that connected her to the family who had never stopped searching. The phone call that would change everything came on a crisp December morning in 2020. Tommy Thompson, now a grandfather himself, sat in his kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, holding the receiver with trembling hands as Sarah Chen explained what she had discovered. His sister Susan, 75 and living just 2 blocks away, arrived within minutes of receiving Tommy's breathless call. The siblings sat at the same kitchen table where they had once waited for their mother to serve breakfast, now processing news that seemed too miraculous to comprehend. Their father James had passed away in 1998, having carried the mystery of his wife's disappearance to his grave, but Margaret's grandchildren and great-grandchildren were very much alive, and the news spread through the extended family like lightning. Within hours, local news stations picked up the story. The impossible had happened in an age when nothing seemed impossible anymore. A woman missing for 63 years had been found alive. Reporter Jennifer Martinez from Channel 6 News was the first to make contact with Margaret Rose Palmer at the Sunset Gardens retirement community in Tucson. The woman who opened the door to her modest apartment was small and silver-haired, moving slowly but with dignity. At 86 years old, Margaret's face bore the lines and character of a life fully lived, but her eyes, those same bright blue eyes from her 1957 wedding photos, held an intelligence that age had not dimmed. "I always wondered if they were still looking for me," she said softly to the cameras, her voice carrying the faint accent of the Midwest, despite decades in Arizona. "I never forgot where I came from. I just couldn't go back." The reunion was arranged for Christmas Day, 2020, in a hotel conference room in Phoenix, neutral ground where a family could attempt to heal wounds that had festered for more than 6 decades. Tommy and Susan made the journey with their children and grandchildren, carrying photo albums and a lifetime of questions. When Margaret saw her children for the first time since they were small, the room fell into a silence so profound that even the cameras stopped rolling momentarily. Tommy, now 67 and white-haired himself, looked into the face of the mother he remembered as young and vibrant, now aged beyond the years they had lost together. "Mama?" Susan whispered, the word carrying the weight of a lifetime of longing. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My babies," she said, her voice breaking. "My beautiful babies." The woman the world thought was gone never stopped living. She had built a new life under a different name, but the memories of the children she had left behind had never faded from her heart. Now, surrounded by generations she had never known existed, Margaret Rose Palmer was finally ready to explain why Margaret Rose Thompson had vanished on that summer morning so long ago. In the quiet of the hotel conference room, with cameras rolling and her family hanging on every word, Margaret Rose Palmer began to unravel a secret she had carried for 63 years. Her voice was steady, but soft, each word carefully chosen, as she reached back into memories she had spent decades trying to forget. "I need you to understand," she began, looking directly at Tommy and Susan. "Leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. But staying would have killed me. The truth, when it came, was both simpler and more heartbreaking than any of the elaborate theories that had circulated over the decades. Behind the facade of the perfect 1950s marriage, Margaret had been living in terror. Her husband James, the same man who had organized search parties and plastered missing person posters throughout the county, had been her tormentor. He was charming to everyone else, Margaret explained, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap. The neighbors thought he was wonderful. Even I thought he was wonderful when we first married. But behind closed doors, she paused, gathering strength from some deep well of courage. The bruises were always where no one could see them. In 1957, domestic violence wasn't discussed in polite society. Women were expected to endure, to keep family problems private, to make their marriages work regardless of the cost. There were no shelters, no hotlines, no support systems for women trying to escape abusive relationships. A woman who left her husband faced social exile, poverty, and the almost certain loss of her children through the legal system. That Tuesday morning, after he left for work, I looked at my baby sleeping so peacefully, and I knew I had to choose. Margaret continued, tears now flowing freely. Stay and risk him eventually hurting you too, or leave and give you a chance at a better life without me. With nothing but the clothes on her back and $47 from the grocery money, Margaret had walked to the highway and caught a ride with a traveling salesman heading west. No internet, no credit cards, no paper trail. In 1957, it was still possible for someone to simply disappear and start over. She worked as a waitress in Colorado, then a seamstress in Nevada, always moving, always careful never to use her real name. Eventually, she settled in Arizona, where she met Robert Palmer, a gentleman who loved her without needing to know her past. They married, had 2 children, and built a quiet life together. "I wanted to come back so many times," Margaret whispered. "But how could I explain? How could I tell you that I chose to leave you? I thought you'd be better off believing I was dead than knowing I had abandoned you." For 6 decades, Margaret Rose Palmer had carried the weight of a mother's impossible choice, never knowing that the man she fled from had spent the rest of his life genuinely searching for her, transformed by grief into the loving father she had never known him capable of being. The silence that followed Margaret's revelation was deafening. In that hotel conference room in Phoenix, 3 generations of the Thompson family sat processing a truth that was both devastating and liberating. The woman they had mourned, the mystery that had defined their family's story, the ghost that had haunted their lives. She was sitting right in front of them, real and breathing, and finally ready to be found. Tommy was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "When all these years, we blamed ourselves," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Susan and I thought we weren't good enough, that we did something wrong to make you leave. Dad never got over it. He died still looking for you." Susan's reaction was more complex, her face cycling through emotions like weather patterns across a stormy sky. "I'm angry," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I'm so angry that you let us think you were dead. But I'm also," she paused, struggling for words, "I'm so grateful you're alive. I don't know how to feel both things at once." Margaret reached across the table, her weathered hand finding her daughter's. "I understand your anger," she said softly. "I've been angry at myself every day for 63 years. But please know that not a single day passed that I didn't think about you, didn't wonder what kind of people you'd grown up to be." The grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who had grown up with stories of the grandmother who vanished, found themselves meeting a living person instead of a family legend. 8-year-old Emma, Tommy's great-granddaughter, approached Margaret with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Are you really my great-grandma?" she asked. "I'm the one from the pictures." Margaret's face lit up with a smile that seemed to erase decades of sorrow. "Yes, sweetheart, I really am." As the initial shock began to settle, something beautiful started to happen. The family members began sharing stories, Tommy and Susan talking about their father's endless search efforts, their own children describing growing up in the shadow of a family mystery, and Margaret sharing memories of the babies she had left behind that she had carried with her across decades and thousands of miles. For 63 years we thought she was gone, Tommy said to the cameras, his arm now around his mother's shoulders. We had funerals without a body, birthdays where we'd set an empty place at the table, Christmases where we'd wonder if she was somewhere thinking of us too. Now, we can finally embrace her. The reunion that followed was captured on film, but felt too intimate for cameras. Generations of Thompsons took turns holding Margaret, as if physical contact could somehow bridge the gap of lost years. There were tears of grief for the time they'd lost, tears of joy for the time they'd found, and tears of relief that the long, painful chapter of not knowing was finally closed. Margaret's other children, the Palmer siblings she'd raised in Arizona, had flown in to meet the family they'd never known existed. The room filled with the chaos and wonder of a family suddenly doubled in size, connected by DNA and divided by decades, but united in the miraculous reality of this impossible reunion. Within hours of the first news broadcast, Margaret Thompson's story exploded across the American media landscape like wildfire in drought season. The headlines were impossible to ignore. Missing woman found after 63 years. DNA test solves 60-year-old mystery. And the Christmas miracle that shocked America. CNN ran the story as their lead segment for 3 consecutive days. The Today Show dedicated an entire hour to the reunion footage, with host Hoda Kotb openly weeping as she watched Margaret embrace her grandchildren for the first time. Social media platforms crashed under the weight of shares, comments, and theories about the case that had captivated the nation. The New York Times assigned their best feature writer to dive deep into the story, publishing a 4,000-word investigation titled The Woman Who Vanished: How DNA Technology Solved America's Longest Cold Case. The article explored not just Margaret's story, but the broader implications of her discovery in an age where genetic genealogy was revolutionizing criminal investigations and family reunifications. Podcast producers immediately recognized the perfect storm of elements that made Margaret's story irresistible: mystery, family drama, social issues, and a happy ending. Vanished: The Margaret Thompson Story became the #1 podcast on Apple within a week of its release, downloaded over 2 million times in its first month. But perhaps the most significant impact was the question Margaret's case raised across kitchen tables and office break rooms throughout America. If she could be found after 63 years, how many other missing people might actually be living under different names, just a DNA test away from being discovered? The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System reported a 400% increase in families submitting DNA samples for comparison in the month following Margaret's story. Cold case detectives across the country found themselves inundated with calls from families wanting to reopen investigations that had been dormant for decades. Detective Sarah Williams from the Sacramento Police Department told reporters, "We've had more tips and DNA submissions in the past 2 weeks than we typically see in a year." Margaret Thompson's case has given hope to thousands of families who thought they'd never get answers. The story also sparked uncomfortable conversations about domestic violence in 1950s America. Women's advocacy groups seized on Margaret's revelations to highlight how far society had come in supporting abuse victims, while also acknowledging how many women of that era might have felt they had no choice but to disappear entirely. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a sociologist at Northwestern University, appeared on multiple news programs to discuss what she called the Margaret Thompson effect. She explained, "This case forces us to reconsider our assumptions about missing persons from previous eras. How many cold cases might actually be women who fled abusive situations when society offered them no other options?" Margaret herself, initially overwhelmed by the attention, eventually agreed to a limited number of interviews. Her story became a symbol of resilience, survival, and the power of modern technology to heal old wounds. But most importantly, it became proof that sometimes the impossible really can happen, that prayers whispered over 63 years of candlelit vigils can still be answered, and that families torn apart by tragedy can somehow find their way back to wholeness. Margaret Thompson's story opened a door to a darker chapter of American history that few had dared to examine closely. As her case dominated headlines, experts in psychology, sociology, and criminal justice began asking uncomfortable questions about how many other missing people might actually be living new lives under assumed identities. Dr. Jennifer Hassan, a forensic psychologist at Georgetown University, appeared on multiple news programs to explain the psychological phenomenon behind voluntary disappearances. In the mid-20th century, particularly for women, disappearing wasn't just about escape. It was about survival, she explained. When society offers no legal protection, no social support, and no economic independence for abuse victims, vanishing becomes a rational response to an impossible situation. The statistics were staggering. According to the National Missing Persons Database, over 2.3 million people were reported missing in the United States between 1940 and 2000. While most cases were resolved quickly, nearly 47,000 people from that era remain officially missing. Their fates unknown, their families still waiting for answers that may never come. But Margaret's case suggested a different possibility entirely. FBI genetic genealogist Dr. Marcus Webb revealed that since 2018, DNA technology had helped identify over 300 previously unknown individuals living under assumed names, people who had disappeared decades ago and built entirely new lives elsewhere. Margaret Thompson represents the tip of an iceberg we're only beginning to understand. Webb told reporters, the comparison cases were remarkable. In 2019, DNA testing revealed that a man named Robert Johnson, missing from Detroit since 1962, had been living as David Martinez in Phoenix for nearly 60 years. In 2021, a woman reported missing from rural Kansas in 1974 was discovered working as a librarian in Oregon under a completely different identity. Each case shared common elements: domestic violence, limited social support systems, and the relative ease with which someone could reinvent themselves in pre-digital America. Margaret's story also highlighted the evolution of missing person investigations. Detective Chief Maria Gonzalez from the Los Angeles Police Department explained, before the internet, before cell phones, before databases that could cross-reference information instantly, disappearing was surprisingly simple. You could walk to the next state, assume a new name, and essentially become a different person. Today, that's nearly impossible. As Margaret settled into her new reality, splitting time between Arizona and Ohio, getting to know grandchildren and great-grandchildren, slowly healing relationships that had been frozen in time for 6 decades, her story continued to inspire both hope and reflection across America. Sometimes, the truth hides in plain sight. For 63 years, Margaret Rose Thompson lived quietly in Arizona, never knowing that thousands of people were still looking for her, still hoping for her return. Her disappearance had become legend, but her survival was simply life, ordinary, precious, and ultimately triumphant. In the end, Margaret's story became more than just a missing person case solved. It became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable bonds of family, and the extraordinary power of love to transcend time, distance, and even the most carefully constructed new identities. The woman who vanished without a trace had been found at last, not because she was lost, but because she was finally ready to be discovered.